On several occasions, my interest in the supernatural has taken me to some of the most prestigious seats of learning in the entire United Kingdom, from the venerable halls of Oxford and Cambridge to the more humble surroundings of the inner-city colleges and schools. My pursuit of evidence to sustain such claims has rarely been fruitful. However, while exploring the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, I found a rather interesting tome hidden away in a dark and musty corner of the campus library. The book itself was unusual, its cover bound in a weathered and blackened leather, which unashamedly wore the wrinkles and cracks of time. It dated back to the 16th century, and it seemed to contain various descriptions and accounts of the daily lives of the people of Ectric, a small isolated town in the south moorlands of the country. Pursuing the volume, there was a variety of entries from a number of authors spanning a 60-year period. It seemed to have been handed down from town elder to town elder over time, and to be quite frank, most of it contained idle musings on townfolk and plans for a number of humble building projects and improvements. Just as I was about to conclude that the book was little of interest to me, I noticed on the inside of the back cover that someone had drawn a picture. It was elegantly depicted, but I would have never described it as a pleasing sight. In fact, my immediate reaction was one of disgust upon first viewing. The combination of harsh, almost angry black lines used and the stark imagery of the image as relayed by the artist left me with a thoroughly unpleasant impression of the subject. I shuddered as I cast my eye over it in attempt to take in the picture of what seemed to be a man, tall with long, thin arms and legs. His face was partially obscured by one of his gaunt white hands, but what could be seen was monstrous. Prominent veins protruded from his forehead, leading up to a pallid and bald skull. His eyes were deep set into the skull, and the surrounding woods seemed to twist and lean away from him fearfully. At first, I assumed that the picture was some form of hideous graffiti, but at the bottom of the page was inscribed the date of 1578. And a rather unusual name, Herbert Solomon. Whether this was the name of the menacing figure in the drawing, the artist, I did not know. Disturbed yet completely compelled by the dark woodland scene, I decided that the book required further study. I desired greatly to know who this creature was, and why someone felt the need to capture his strange form in a drawing. A drawing at the back of a book otherwise unused to record the lives of the townfolk. On closer inspection, what surprised me further was that the same image seemed to recur everywhere else in the book, but drawn by apparently different individuals. Within the book I found numerous mentions of Herbert Solomon, and it became clear quickly that he was indeed the emancipated man in the picture. He had lived in the 16th century on the outskirts of Ettrick town, and it was a small and underdeveloped place surrounded on all sides by the thick cover of the Ettrick forest, which itself sat in the midst of a vast region of southern moorland. The town had a small parish church with one humble steeple, an inn normally used by those traveling through the unforgiving countryside, and quaint cobbled streets which wound their way around the stone cottages and town hall. According to the descriptions in the book, during December of 1577, children began to disappear from the town. The first was a young girl by the name of Elena Sutherland. She had been playing with some friends by an old well on the outskirts of town, but had dropped the small toy down it accidentally, which caused her much distress. Unable to retrieve it, she returned home to borrow some string and an old hook, in hopes of being able to fish the doll out of the water below. She was last seen walking towards the well just as the sun set. In a panic, the townsfolk searched. They dredged the well, they combed the wheat fields, and even sent several groups of those willing into the surrounding woods. Alas, the girl was not found. A few days later, a young boy by the name of Eric Kennedy was running an errand for his grandmother. It was dark, but he only had to take some wool over to the Monroe place as a way of thanks for the grain they had provided, and they lived but only a few streets away. It was assumed that at the last center of the town would be safe. But the boy never completed his errand. He vanished as if he were torn from existence. By the end of January, an unusually bitter winter had caused significant damage to the town and its people. Large, thick sheets of ice and snow covered each house in the building. Several people died from the cold alone, and the general mood of Erktik town was a somber one. Despite these trying times, the town people were more concerned with the safety of their offspring. In total, 7 children had now disappeared without rhyme or reason. Whole families wept in despair, and the people of Erktik began to view one another suspiciously. They knew the truth. Someone was taking their children from them. By mid-February, 2 more had went missing, and the customary glances were now being shared between every family and every member of the community. The town elder decided to act, and took it upon himself the arduous task of identifying and catching the fiend. Voracious discussions were had, church groups convened, and every house in the street in every corner of Erktik had one name cross the lips of its inhabitants: Herbert Solomon. The more the name was mentioned, the more certain his guilt became. Herbert Solomon was an outsider. He lived in a small wooden cabin amongst the woods which surround the town, and due to his unfortunate appearance, tended to avoid human contact. What his malady was no one sure. What his malady was no one was sure, and in the unenlightened times of the 16th century Scotland, many believed that he was cursed. Modern eyes would have guessed him to be the victim of a wasting disease. He rarely ventured into town except for on a few occasions to trade for supplies, and even in those instances he covered his face with a brown tarnished hat and a gray piece of cloth which obscured his features below 2 deep-set and darkened eyes. Several of the townsfolk told stories of Herbert Solomon. According to these accounts, he would stand on the edge of the forest watching the farmers till their land and their children play in the fields. It was his fascination with children which left many feeling uneasy. Some of the town's children returned home from playing near the woods on a number of occasions with beautifully crafted dolls and toys. They were a present from Herbert Solomon, and being innocent children, they could not know the dangers therein. When the children began to disappear, eyes immediately turned to the strange man living in the woods. Accusations were carried by the whisperers of fearful parents, and the whispers increased in number, so did their volume, until it was decided that Herbert Solomon must be stopped. On a cold February night, the elders of the town decreed that Solomon should be arrested immediately. Grief, anger, resentment, and fear grew to a fever pitch with this news, and every man and woman and child set out across the fields, entering into the surrounding forest in search of the child killer Herbert Solomon. Details of exactly what occurred that night are limited, but it seems as though the people of Erktik town attempted to remove Herbert from a small cabin by setting it on fire. The crowds cheered as the heat grew.